2. The formation of imperialism. The Japanese-Russian War brought victory to Japan. True, if, after the Battle of Mukden, Japan had not received enormous financial and material assistance from England and the USA, it would not have been able to continue the war. However, England and especially the United States did not want the complete victory of the Japanese. Under pressure from America, a peace treaty was concluded between Japan and Russia. As a result of the war, Japan achieved its goals in relation to Korea and Manchuria and, in addition, southern Sakhalin was transferred to it. Japanese capitalism, using this war, made a new leap forward. Before the war, by the end of 1903, the total paid-up capital of all Japanese companies was 890 million yen, and by the end of 1910 1,480 million. Japanese goods flowed into Manchuria in a wide flow, displacing goods from England and the United States from there. Heavy industry began to form. However, all this could not eliminate the qualitative weakness of Japanese capitalism. In 1907, the country was gripped by a deep economic crisis, after which a period of prolonged depression came. Nevertheless, new industrial enterprises were also built during this period, and mining was developing. And it was precisely these factors that were used to create the monopolistic capital of Zaibatsu. In many cases, industrial development was based on Anglo-American capital. From 1906 until the outbreak of World War I, the total amount of foreign capital in Japan increased by 640 million yen, while the amount of paid-in capital of Japanese companies increased by 1 billion yen over the same period. A comparison of these figures shows how great the value of foreign capital was for Japan. Thus, the transformation of Japan into an imperialist power was accompanied by an increase in its financial dependence on England and the United States. Monarchy and capitalism sought to make up for this weakness by robbing Taiwan, Korea, and Manchuria. Having sharply rejected America's harassment to take part in the operation of the South Manchurian Railway, they independently controlled the road and strenuously pursued a policy of completely eliminating foreign influence in southern Manchuria. Having ousted Tsarist Russia from Korea and breaking the resistance of the Korean people, Japan in 1910 annexed this country. Taiwan's indigenous people, as well as the Chinese landowners and small business owners, were ruthlessly oppressed. The Japanese took their land from them and, based on the slave exploitation of the local population, created the sugar industry there. All this led to an increase in the contradictions between Japan and the imperialist powers, especially America, on the issue of the Manchu market. Since the United States could not cross the Pacific Ocean and attack Japan, it forced them to make several concessions. In 1905, the Katsura-Taft Secret Agreement was concluded, recognizing Japan's monopoly on Korea, and in 1908, the Takehire-Ruth Agreement about the same content as the previous one. Nevertheless, America, resorting to dollar diplomacy, sought to extend its influence to northern China and Manchuria. The struggle between Japanese and American imperialism in China that arose in about 30 years later led to a war in the Pacific. In 1911, a revolution was successfully carried out in China, as a result of which the Qing dynasty was overthrown and the Republic of China was formed in February next year. But the betrayal of the militarists led to the fact that lasting unity of all the forces of China could not be achieved. Riots broke out in the country every now and then. Taking advantage of this, Japan in 1911 inspired the movement for independence of Manchuria and Mongolia. In southern China, she supported revolutionary groups, hoping after their victory to receive abundant rewards. In the north, she opposed Yuan Shikai, who held a pro-English and pro-American position. In order to counter American imperialism, to realize their aggressive plans in China and at the same time suppress the struggle of the Korean people against Japanese imperialism, the ruling classes of Japan fought a frantic arms race. The military stubbornly demanded the creation of new 4 divisions and the construction of 88 warships. But this was beyond the power of the Japanese economy, as a result of which even some of the large capitalists opposed the demands of the military. However, the big capitalists did not refuse from the main policy of Japan, which sought to make up for the weakness of the Japanese economy with the help of military force. And the more economic difficulties grew, the fiercer the Japanese aggression in China became. As a result of such a policy of the ruling classes, the life of the Japanese people deteriorated sharply, resulting in an explosion of indignation of the people deceived by the Japanese-Russian War. In September 1905, unrest erupted. People began setting fire to police stations throughout Tokyo. The masses were no longer afraid of an open clash with the authorities. So far this has resulted only in rebellion. After the economic crisis, a powerful wave of strikes broke out in mines and in military arsenals. Troops were thrown against the strikers. Strikes took place in other factories. Rental conflicts have become more frequent. The activity of the socialists revived. To suppress the movement of the people, the government in 1910 fabricated the so-called state crime case and even forbade the use of the word social. As a result of these brutal repressions, the socialist movement temporarily froze, but the struggle of the working class did not stop. The big capitalist Shibuzawa Eiichi helped Suzuki Bunji organize the Workers' Mutual Assistance Society (UKI), which aimed to achieve cooperation between labor and capital. Whatever the program of this society and whoever is its leader, advanced workers who needed their own organization entered into it and directed its activity along the path of uniting the workers of the whole country. The high fighting spirit of the working class inspired the progressive layers of the petty bourgeoisie, representing the common interests of that part of industrial capital that was oppressed by the zaibatsu. They fought against the dictatorship of the monarchy and especially the military, opposed the policy of military expansion. These strata insisted that the government should be responsible not only to the emperor, but also to parliament. They demanded the abolition of the system, by which only generals and admirals in active service could hold the posts of military and naval ministers, put forward the demand for the liquidation of the emperor's right to exercise the highest command of the armed forces, and together with the workers sought universal suffrage. In 1912 to 1913, a movement began in the country in defense of the Constitution, the leading force of which was representatives of the petty bourgeoisie. The people surrounded the parliament building and demanded the resignation of the military bureaucratic cabinet of Katsura, who, hiding under the supreme power of the emperor, carried out autocratic government. Katsura had no choice but to resign. This struggle led to the fact that in 1913 the system of subordination of state institutions was revised. A rule was introduced according to which a candidate for the post of military and naval minister could also be selected from among generals or lieutenant generals who are not in active service. In 1914, the fact of corruption in the Navy was revealed. The case of Siemens. Tens of thousands of Tokyo residents gathered for a rally in Kibaya Park near Parliament and demanded the resignation of the cabinet of Yamamoto, a protege of the naval circles. The rally ended in a bloody clash with large police forces, but the people did not flinch and did not back down. And economically and politically, inside and outside the country, the position of the monarchy and the big bourgeoisie became more and more difficult every year. They saw a way out of this in an aggressive war against China, which they sought to unleash under any pretext. Just at that time, in August 1914, the First World War began. For the ruling classes of Japan, it was truly a grace of heaven. Under the pretext of fulfilling the obligations arising from the Japanese-English Union Treaty, the Japanese government, despite the anxiety of England itself, decided to enter the war. The Japanese army quickly defeated the German troops in China, in the province of Shandong, seized German concessions and adjacent Chinese territory, deploying a huge number of their troops there. In January 1915, the Japanese government submitted to the Chinese government 21 demands. These requirements consisted of 5 sections. The first section provided for the actual transformation of Shandong province into Japanese territory. The requirements of the second section actually led to the transformation of the eastern part of Inner Mongolia and southern Manchuria into Japanese territory. The third section provided for the transfer to the monopoly possession of Japan Honibinskogo coal metallurgical plant. The fourth section obliged China not to provide the third powers with ports, as well as islands along the Chinese coast. The fifth section obliged the Chinese government to invite the Japanese as military and financial advisors, to create a unified Japanese-Chinese police, or to invite the Japanese to serve in the police as advisors. It was also envisaged that the necessary amount of weapons for the Chinese army will be delivered from Japan. Otherwise, the production of weapons in China was supposed to be transferred to the hands of the Japanese. These requirements included 7 more points, the purpose of which was to turn the entire territory of China into a Japanese colony. Even the corrupt government of Yuan Shikai could not accept all these requirements. When it published them, a wave of popular outrage rose in China. The Chinese people, who had previously considered Japan to be the most advanced country in the Far East, the country with which to take an example, and having seen their friend in it, realized that it was Japanese imperialism that was its worst enemy. Frightened by the protest of the Chinese people, the Japanese government announced its rejection of the requirements contained in the 5th section. But it did not for a second lose sight of the objectives mentioned in this section. For their implementation, Japan supported a conspiracy aimed at creating the monarchical regime of Yuan Shikai, while various intrigues to weaken China and split it. During the First World War, Japan enjoyed both the benefits of a belligerent and the benefits of a neutral state. As noted above, the Japanese army fought only with small German troops in Shandong province. In addition, She carried out operations to capture German-owned and almost unprotected islands in the South Pacific. At the end of the war, Japan sent a small squadron to the Entente to transport the Mediterranean Sea. This squadron was sent only after Japan enlisted the promise of England and France that with the end of the war they would transfer to the Japanese possession the occupied islands that formerly belonged to Germany. With almost no burden of war, Japan, however, was able to extract from its several battles operations enormous benefits. Not to mention China, the entire Far East and the countries of the South Seas, where the goods of European states and the United States stopped flowing, were flooded with Japanese products. In addition, Japan sold weapons and military materials to its allies. As a result of all this, Japanese capitalism entered its unprecedented heyday. From the end of 1914 until 1920, the total paid-up capital of Japanese companies increased from 2,070 million to 8,240 million yen. The number of factories and plants increased from 31,714 to 45,806. The number of workers employed at them increased from 850,000 to 1,550,000 people. Over the same period, the volume of production in the mining industry increased by more than 5 times, in engineering by 8 times, in metallurgy by 6.5 times. The shipbuilding and metallurgical industries made a particularly big leap. So in Japan, a heavy industry was created. For a long time in Japanese foreign trade, import dominated export, and already in 1915 to 1918 export exceeded imports. The total amount of foreign trade operations reached 1,493 million yen. In agriculture, 170 million silk cocoons were produced in 1914, and 770 million yen in 1919. Significantly increased production of agricultural products, as well as livestock products. The first sprouts of future Kalak farms appeared. The heyday of the Japanese economy contributed to the creation of monopolistic capital zaibatsu. Japan entered the stage of imperialism. 3. General crisis. An unprecedented favorable situation and the sharp growth of industry did not change the semi-feudal nature of agriculture in Japan. Did not change the links that existed between it and capitalist industry. However, although significant changes in this matter did not occur, the extremely rapid development of industry in the city caused an equally rapid increase in the contradictions between industry and agriculture. In August 1918, these contradictions broke out. In the midst of an unprecedented economic boom, the largest hunger riots in the history of Japan, the so-called rice riots, began to flare up in all parts of the country. The main causes of rice riots were as follows. 1. Despite the increased need for rice due to the growth of the population employed in industry, as well as the growth of the rest of the urban population caused by the rapid development of capitalism, rice production did not increase much, since the productive forces in agriculture were constrained by the parasitic landowner system land tenure. However, the amount of rice consumed by peasants increased. All this led to a gap between the demand for rice and the ability to meet this demand. 2. The government, protecting the interests of the landlords, did not abolish duties on rice imported from abroad and, having granted a monopoly on its import to the privileged trading houses of Mitsui, Suzuki and others, thereby giving them the opportunity to unlimitedly increase the price of rice. 3. Due to the fact that at that time the government created the rice reserves necessary for the army to intervene against Soviet Russia, the shortage of rice in the country became even more acute, which led to an incredible speculation of rice. 4. Despite the sharp rise in rice prices due to inflation, real wages and incomes have steadily declined. 5. After the arson of police posts in Tokyo in 1905, it was already possible to talk about the continuity of the movement of the masses. Moreover, under the influence of the Great October Socialist Revolution of 1917, a radical change occurred in the mood of the Japanese people. All of these reasons, taken together, triggered rice riots. Their appearance meant that the contradictions of Japanese capitalism reached such an extent that it was no longer possible to smooth or eliminate them. It also meant that the general crisis of world capitalism that arose as a result of the revolution in Russia captured Japanese capitalism. Rice riots were the beginning of the general crisis of capitalism in Japan. This is clearly seen from the fact that, as we will discuss below, after the rice riots, the contradictions of Japanese imperialism began to develop rapidly. Rice riots, like a hurricane, swept across the country. In 60 cities they took such proportions that they had to resort to the armed force to suppress them, but the struggle in these cities lasted only a few days. Miners stayed a little longer. The short duration of these unrests was explained by both their spontaneous nature and the lack of organization among the workers, and in this sense, the rice riots did not differ from the previous Utakashi. Nonetheless, these riots contributed to the rapid growth of class consciousness of the Japanese people. As a result of this, and also in connection with the deepening influence of the Great October Socialist Revolution, the class struggle of the workers and peasants was rapidly developing. Strikes, led by workers in the arsenals, shipbuilding, metallurgical, engineering, textile and other branches of large-scale industry, have grown both quantitatively and qualitatively. In all industries, trade unions began to form. In 1919, the Mutual Assistance Workers Society was renamed the Japan Federation of Mutual Assistance Workers Associations Nihon Rudokami Satomei Yukai. 2 years later, the word yukai was deleted from this name, and this organization became known as the Japan Federation of Labor Nihon Rado Satomei. The Japan Labor Federation established contact with the socialists and embarked on the path of the class trade union. In 1920, Tokyo hosted the country's first May Day demonstration, in which 10,000 workers participated. According to official statistics, the number of rental conflicts grew from 256 in 1918 to 1680, and it's about 7 times in 1921. The first peasant union in Japan was created in 1922. In March 1922, the Suazese Society was formed. The liberation movement quickly spread throughout the country. The women's movement, which has become a genuine mass movement, has gone beyond the activities of small groups of women from among the petty bourgeoisie. The Marxist movement of students began. Everyone who was exploited and oppressed rose to the fight. In July 1922, the Communist Party of Japan was created. It began to act as the revolutionary vanguard of the working class and the entire Japanese people, with the goal of destroying the monarchy and establishing a democratic republic. Thus, for the first time in the history of Japan, the conscious struggle of the masses unfolded, seeking to establish their own power. During the period of rice riots, the monarchy and the monopoly bourgeoisie, which aimed to strangle the revolution in Russia, sent expeditionary forces of 73,000 people to Siberia. This action was an integral part of the intervention of world imperialism against Soviet Russia, in which Japan took an active part. This is explained as follows. First, Japanese imperialism, torn by contradictions, was seized by fear that the very fact of the formation and existence of a socialist state would have a revolutionary effect on the peoples of the countries neighboring Japan, Korea, and China. Secondly, the cherished desire of the Japanese ruling classes was to seize the natural wealth of Siberia and northern Sakhalin. After America frustrated these plans as a result of economic competition, the ruling classes of Japan began to seek to seize Siberia and northern Sakhalin by military force in order to create their regimes pleasing to the Japanese imperialists. Third, Japan intended to use expeditionary forces to establish their monopoly domination in northern Manchuria and outer Mongolia. As you know, Japan's plans ended in complete failure. Even after other countries, admitting defeat, withdrew the expeditionary armies from Soviet Russia, Japan stubbornly kept its troops in Siberia until October 1922. And its special army occupied northern Sakhalin until May 1925. By this she achieved nothing, only exacerbating her defeat and demonstrating her aggressiveness to the whole world. The war against Soviet Russia was a war waged only by the monarchy and the powerful Zaibatsu. The people categorically opposed her. Tokizei Simpo magazine and other press bodies sharply protested against intervention and demanded immediate recognition of worker-peasant Russia. Even the Osaka Asahi Shimbun newspaper opposed secret diplomacy and sending troops to Siberia, although not so openly. Advanced Japanese workers, such as Sato Michio, together with the Soviet people, fought in Siberia against Japanese imperialism and gave their lives in the struggle to defend the socialist revolution. In 1922, Katayama-sen led propaganda in Siberia among the Japanese troops, urging them to launch a campaign for immediate return to their homeland. At the May Day demonstration in 1922 in Tokyo, workers put forward a demand for the withdrawal of troops from Siberia and the recognition of worker-peasant Russia. Immediately after that, in response to the call of the British workers, the Japanese workers created the Committee on Non-Intervention in the Affairs of Russia, which included representatives of trade unions and a number of progressive public organizations. The internationalism of the Japanese working class was much more developed at that time than during the Japanese-Russian War. March 1, 1919 in Korea, which was a Japanese colony, a popular uprising broke out under the influence of the Great October Socialist Revolution. The uprising, held under the slogan "Long Live the Independence of Korea," swept the whole country. For 3 months, the participants in the uprising fought with the Japanese army and the police, but even after the main forces of the rebels were broken, the struggle continued for several months. Even after the uprising was suppressed, the Korean people did not stop the struggle against the brutal domination of the colonialists. The contradictions between the colonial economy of Korea and the economy of the mother country grew, which found expression in the following. Firstly, Japan was forced to allocate huge funds from its budget to support the army and the police, which ensured its dominance in Korea. Secondly, after the March Uprising, Japan, in an effort to deceive the Korean people and at the same time resolve the food problem domestically, developed a 15-year plan to increase rice production in Korea, which was contrary to the interests of the Japanese landowners. In addition, most of the rice produced in Korea was forcibly taken from the peasants and sent to Japan. And the more rice the Koreans produced, the less they consumed it. Koreans were forced to eat the plague imported from Manchuria. Such robbery reduced the importance of Korea as a market for Japanese goods. The same situation has developed in Taiwan. Every year the struggle of the Chinese people against Japanese imperialism intensified. In 1918, Japan created bases in China for aggression against Russia, putting the costs of their maintenance on the Chinese. She forced the Duan Kizhu government to sign the Sino-Japanese Joint Defense Agreement, which gave her the opportunity to control the Chinese army at her discretion. These actions of Japan sparked a movement in China to boycott Japanese goods. An anti-Japanese struggle broke out across the country, led by Chinese students and representatives of trade circles. In an effort to bribe the government of Duan Kizhu, Japan granted him a loan of 240 million yen. The Japanese capitalists, and above all the capitalists of the spinning and weaving industry, built factories in Shanghai, Qingdao and other cities of China, established a stick regime for the Chinese workers, exploiting them literally as slaves. It is quite clear that the anti-Japanese struggle was not fought by the Chinese militarists, but by the masses. Protests against the transfer to Japan of former German concessions in the province of Shandong, as provided for by the Treaty of Versailles, led to the famous movement on May 4, 1919. This movement was the starting point of the victorious national liberation struggle of the Chinese people, during which the leading role passed to the proletariat. After the First World War, there was a further aggravation of the contradictions between the Japanese imperialists and the imperialists of the great powers, especially the United States. The inevitability of war between Japan and America was promoted. During World War I, the United States compromised with Japan, recognizing Japan's special interests in China in accordance with the Lansing-Ishii Agreement of 1917, but they went on the offensive after the war ended. The first restrictions were imposed on Japan by the Washington Conference of 1921 to 4,922. At this conference, the tonnage of the Japanese linear fleet was limited to 60% of the United States linear fleet. Thus, the monopoly of Japan in the field of military power in the Far East was shaken, which was the most important condition for the existence of Japanese imperialism and monarchy. At the same conference, a nine-power treaty was concluded that limited Japan's rights that it had snatched from China during World War II and negated the concessions the United States made. Under the pretext of implementing the principle of open doors, the great powers established joint control over China. Before American imperialism, the doors to penetrate this country were wide open. Just during this period, under pressure from the United States, the Anglo-Japanese alliance was terminated. Already not one of the imperialist powers supported Japan. Japanese imperialism was isolated. The aggravation of class contradictions in the country that followed the rice riots, the failure of the intervention in Russia, the expansion of the struggle against Japanese imperialism in Korea and China, the aggravation of contradictions with American imperialism. All these factors led to the deepening crisis of Japanese imperialism, further aggravated by the economic crisis of 1920. During the First World War in Japan, productive forces increased significantly, so the narrowing of markets after its end inevitably led to a crisis of overproduction. After 1919, Japan's trade balance became passive, which clearly indicated a rapid narrowing of sales markets, but production continued to grow rapidly. This led to the fact that in March 1920 a sharp drop in the stock price began. Significantly reduced prices for goods. Production was reduced primarily in the cotton and wool sectors, as well as in the steel, copper, smelting, sugar, silk weaving and other industries. Bankruptcies of banks and companies followed one after another. The sharp drop in the prices of raw silk and rice dealt a severe blow to the peasants. After all these events, the Japanese economy could no longer recover. In 1921, she was shocked by a reduction in armaments. In 1922, 29 banks went bankrupt. The strongest earthquake in the Kanto region in 1923 brought the country's economy into a state of complete disruption. In 1924, there was a slight increase in production associated with the restoration of the damage caused by the earthquake, but there were also cases of bankruptcy during this period. In 1925 there was a financial panic resulting from the collapse of a large trading company Toyota and a huge deficit of Taiwan in Korean banks. Japanese 36. The government sought to prevent the economic crisis by providing direct material assistance to companies, reducing taxes, subsidizing enterprises, and expanding production through capital invested by the government itself, which led to a huge increase in government loans. Inflation intensified. That is why the Japanese government was not able to lift the embargo on the export of gold imposed after the United States in September 1917, although the latter lifted the embargo in June 1919, and England in April 1925. They feared that lifting the embargo would inevitably cause deflation, increase the bankruptcy of industrial enterprises, and damage the landowners who traded rice. Thus, 4. The catastrophe. Secondary transformation into an oppressed country. The working class suffered the greatest losses from the economic collapse. After the crisis of 1920, the number of unemployed increased sharply. The problem of unemployment has become one of the most serious problems in Japanese politics. Previously, the village absorbed the unemployed, which filled the cities, and now the village itself could not feed itself. The workers and peasants had only one way out, having united, wage a struggle with the capitalists, landowners and the government. Workers and peasants' unions grew rapidly. They were not broken by brutal repressions of the government. The political struggle of the proletariat intensified. There were demands to establish universal suffrage, to revise the law on maintaining public peace by the police, law of 1900, ed. To abolish other reactionary ones laws, withdraw troops from Siberia, recognize Soviet Russia, etc. Since 1921, demands were made to create a legal social democratic party. The demands of the workers and peasants masses had an impact on the democratically inclined part of the petty bourgeoisie, which joined in the stubborn struggle for universal suffrage. The monopoly bourgeoisie also supported this demand, since it hoped, through the introduction of general elections, to limit the struggle of the masses to the walls of Parliament and to use the elections as a means of spreading their influence over the organs of monarchical power. But by no means could she allow the general election to raise the political consciousness of the workers and peasants and become a weapon in their struggle. A characteristic fact, Ozaki Yukio, who propagandized the idea of general elections to give the labor movement a spirit of realism, received funds from the Ministry of the Court, that is, from the Emperor. One of the results of this complex class struggle was that in 1924 political power fell into the hands of three parties, Kansakai, Seiukai and Kokuzen Kurabu, who opposed bureaucratic offices in defense of constitutional rule. At the beginning of 1925, at the 50th session of Parliament, the law on universal suffrage for men was adopted. At the same time, the law on maintaining public peace was adopted, which, under the guise of suppressing communism, was in fact aimed at suppressing any democratic movement. There is an opinion that after the formation of the first cabinet of the three parties that supported constitutional rule, the creation of party cabinets came into practice in Japan, which supposedly indicates that the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie became the state power in Japan. However, this view is not true. The formation of a three-party cabinet meant only that the connection of monopoly capital, landowners and the monarchist bureaucracy became even closer, that the political power of the monopoly bourgeoisie strengthened. Despite the creation of the cabinet, the monarchy retained its independence. General elections and some other government events have not in the least reduced the power of the military, covered by the shield of the Privy Council, shield of the existing system for the appointment of military and naval ministers and the monopoly of the emperor to lead the armed forces. If the Parliament expressed no confidence in the cabinet, this was not a reason for the cabinet to resign, but if the Privy Council, the military and naval ministries opposed it, the cabinet was forced to resign, no matter how its parliament supported it. The so-called party cabinets were by no means party in the true sense of the word. This is evident even from the fact that the military and naval ministers did not have the right to belong to any party, and the foreign minister was necessarily appointed from among the bureaucratic elite of the foreign ministry. In addition, the parties themselves were an association of bureaucracy, landlords and the bourgeoisie, and party leaders. As a rule, what was the activity of the party offices? The three-party cabinet of Kato Toakaki, and after his death, the cabinet of Wakatsuki Reihiro declared a policy of international cooperation. In 1925, Japan truly recognized the Soviet Union and expressed its desire to cooperate with America and England on the question of China. But it was only in appearance. We should not forget that it was Kato who was the very Minister of Foreign Affairs who initiated the presentation of 21 demands to China. In 1925, the party cabinet sent warships to China to quell the struggle unfolding in China on May 30th. Japanese troops, pouring into the army of the Mukden militarist Zhang Zuolin at the direction of this cabinet, were at war with the Chilean militarists, targeting England and the United States. In March 1926, the party cabinet sent warships to Dog, where they bombarded the anti-Japanese forces. All these aggressive actions were carried out mainly in collaboration with England and the United States. That was the policy of international cooperation. Inside the country, the government used the law on maintaining public peace primarily to suppress the student movement. When the Japanese Peasant Union, the All-Japan Council of Trade Unions (HJCI), and other organizations of workers and peasants with great difficulty created a united front and the Workers' and Peasants' Party (Pro-Noto), the only legal party of the proletariat, the government immediately issued a decree on its dissolution, December 1925. Arbitrarily committing these acts of despotism, it defended the interests of zaibatsu and landowners. However, soon the ruling classes lost their prudence and composure, which in foreign policy helped them avoid clashes with England and the United States, and in the domestic one they made it possible to create some kind of appearance of democracy. This happened because Japan, as we noted above, was facing an economic crisis. In addition, in 1927, a serious financial crisis erupted in the country. On the other hand, since 1926, the Chinese Revolution began to develop at such a pace that the very foundations of Japanese imperialism were shocked. Under these conditions, the Japanese ruling classes sought to prevent the unification of the young forces of China. They decided to establish reliable political power there, preserve the Chinese market and, at the same time, split China, weaken it. There was no time for cooperation with the United States and England, not until the appearance of constitutional rule. The ruling classes were in such a position that they could think and act in only one direction: how to eliminate more and more new phenomena that testified to a further aggravation of internal contradictions. With their own hands, they destroyed three conditions that ensured the successes of Japanese imperialism in the past. So, they not only did not use Anglo-American contradictions, but, on the contrary, embarked on the path of open aggression in China, on the path of repression within the country, which forced all imperialist states to come up against Japan as a united front. This policy of Japan was marked by the resignation of the Wakatsuki cabinet and its replacement by the Tanaka cabinet, the sending of Japanese troops to Shandong, the secret assassination of Zhang Zuolin, the March 15 events, the revision of the law on maintaining public peace, and the aggressive war in Manchuria 1931, the incidents of May 15 and February 23, and finally the war in the Pacific. The history of this period is described in detail in this paper. The ruling classes came to an unprecedented defeat not in the period when they, on the one hand, crept before the Western powers, and on the other, pursued an aggressive policy, and then when their whole policy began to boil down to one thing: aggression. The severity of the defeat fell on the shoulders of the Japanese people. The Japanese nation has again become an oppressed nation. But this oppression is not like what Japan experienced in the past. The colonial oppression of the most powerful imperialism in the world is now established over Japan. The oppression is not of a civilian court, but of a military court. The oppression is not of ordinary foreign settlements, but of foreign military bases covering the entire Japanese land. This oppression does not mean levying a tax of 1/5 of the value of the goods. It means the transfer into the hands of foreigners of all industry and finance, of the whole economy. But those who unleashed an aggressive war, which with all its weight fell upon the people, managed to profit even from defeat, becoming an instrument of the American occupation regime. They were well aware of the historical role of Japanese imperialism, which, on the one hand, pursued an aggressive policy and, on the other, cringed against foreign imperialism. Under the conditions of the occupation regime, power in Japan was gained by pro-American and pro-English diplomats who dream of the day when they, slavishly groveling before America, will revive Japanese militarism, and that, being the vanguard of the American army, will lead an attack against Asian countries. As long as the old monarchical system exists in Japan, but the world has changed. Especially serious, radical changes have occurred in the East. China and Korea became people's republics, full of young, creative forces. Changes have occurred in the Japanese people. The revolutionary, peaceful traditions of the Japanese people, both in quantitative and qualitative terms, have received such enormous development that it was impossible to dream of in the past. This is predetermined by the whole course of history. The world will conquer the war. The people will conquer the corrupt reaction. The Japanese people will fight for their full independence, for eternal peace, for popular democracy. This will be revolutionary independence, completely different from that which Japan received 60 years ago as a result of the revision of unequal treaties. This is a historical pattern.